Hopefully everyone is doing well. We're getting close to spring break, which is always a good thing. Hard to believe that we're midway through March already, but probably none of us will be complaining. I know many of you are getting close to graduation, which is exciting too. So in terms of our content, we're a little bit behind, which is okay, but since we have had so many snow days, and they all seem to fall on Thursdays. What we're going to talk about today is the supervisory relationship a little bit more. So you guys read about this about 2 weeks ago, so it's been a little while. But I want to spend a little bit more time talking about the supervisory relationship because I think it's a really important part of supervision. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this, have a bit of a discussion, and then we're going to spend about a half an hour watching a video that's going to talk about something called the supervision question, and then we'll just have a little bit of discussion around that. So let me pull up. These slides are posted for you. They're just back a couple modules. I believe they're in week 6. So you can find those there if you want to go back and take a look at them. So let me share this with you. Okay, so again, we'll talk a little bit about the supervisory relationship. We touched on this at the beginning of the semester when we talked about defining supervision and what we thought some good qualities would be of a supervisor, and then some things that we thought we wouldn't want to see in supervisors, which I know we've all probably had good supervisors and maybe supervisors that leave us wanting a bit more. So let's just talk a little bit about this. This is not a tremendous amount of content, but just a bit of a review since you read this a little bit while ago. All right. So when we think about the supervisory relationship, there do tend to be a couple different phases to this relationship. This may parallel the counseling or therapy relationship. So early on in the supervisory relationship, you need to clarify what that relationship is. So the supervisor's job is really to outline that for the supervisee, let them know what's expected and how supervision is going to work. You also need to work together to develop ways to work collaboratively and effectively. This may look a little bit different with each supervisee. And ideally, you should design a supervision contract. So this is a bit more explicit in terms of what is expected of the supervisee and the supervisor. It should include how the supervisee will be evaluated. And ideally, of course, the supervisor should have an opportunity to be evaluated as well. So just being really clear about what's expected. This might include how often you're going to meet, how you can be contacted in between sessions, what is the supervisor supervising, things of that nature. So then you move from the early phase into the mature phase. And this is where there's an increase on the individual nature of the relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee. You can also, at this time, this can kind of build a social relationship, a professional but social relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee. And the trainee develops case conceptualization skills, and they should also be increasing their confidence around this time. And also, depending upon what type of supervision relationship you have, this may also be an opportunity as the supervisee becomes more comfortable to explore personal issues that might be impacting their personal performance. Or if they go into a session and this brings something up for them. This may be an opportunity. Again, I would argue this should probably be limited to how these personal issues impact professional performance. It doesn't mean that we don't all come in with our own challenges and our own issues. But if the supervisory relationship becomes really talking a lot about the supervisee's issues, that may be a good opportunity for the supervisor to suggest that the supervisee seeks some outside counseling where they can discuss those issues. And then finally, like in a counseling relationship, you also have a termination phase of the supervisory relationship. This is where there tends to be increased collaborative structure, so less about the supervisor telling the supervisee what to do, and this becomes a much more collaborative process as the supervisee becomes more comfortable. Trainees also start to understand the connection between theory, so learning all these different theories, and then how that translates in their practice. So again, there's going to be less direction from the supervisor at this point. And you also are going to you should have some evaluation throughout the process, so more informal feedback. But at the end or towards the end of the supervisory relationship, you also should have that summative evaluation. So providing some more formal feedback to the supervisee. And I think probably the most important part of this feedback is, even if a supervisee is doing well, I think giving them some areas where you see where they maybe have some more room to grow, so that they have some things to work on, and then giving them some concrete feedback about how you think they might be able to work on these things. And then, since this tends to be a stepping stone in an individual's professional development, discussing those future professional goals can also be an important part of this termination phase of the supervisory relationship. So some key elements: it's important to establish and maintain a good connection with supervisees. I think we can probably all think about good relationships that we've had with others and others that struggle. And I think in a professional setting, even someone taking the time to really get to know you and be invested in your professional development can be an important aspect. So this is a broad question, and you don't even have to think about this necessarily in relation to a supervisory relationship, but how do we form relationships with others? Like, what do you think are the key things we do when we want to establish a new relationship with someone? So this could be a friendship, it could be really anything. So just what do you think are some of those?
Communicate.
Sorry,
I did. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Melissa, go ahead.
Were you asking? I'm so sorry. I thought you were asking us as if you wanted us to answer. I apologize.
No, absolutely. Please do. I just didn't hear what you said. So if you could repeat.
I said communicate. I meant,
communicate.
Like when you want to establish some kind of a connection with somebody, whether it be personal or professional, you reach out, you call them, you send them an email, those kind of things.
Absolutely. Yes. So communication, a really important first step, right? If we're not communicating with someone, we have no chance of forming a relationship. So that communication is key, and maybe how we go about that can be important. Any other things that you think are important as we form relationships?
Learning more about the other person, sharing more about yourself.
Yeah, so taking an interest in someone, asking questions. It also gives you an opportunity to learn more about yourself. Absolutely.
Being dependable.
Being dependable. Yeah, so being available, if you say you're going to do something, do it, right? Absolutely. Other thoughts that anyone has?
I feel like developing the trust to have the hard conversations is also important.
Absolutely. So working on developing trust, which can take time, right? We have to make ourselves vulnerable to be open to these relationships. So yes, developing trust. Yeah, Sarah.
Yeah, being social, if you spend time together in different settings, it helps you learn more about each other and get to know each other in a more natural way.
Absolutely. So being social, putting ourselves out there, having those opportunities to get to know new individuals. Okay, so those are all some really good points. So thoughts here about a supervisory relationship. I think some of these things absolutely apply. Is there any way that you think a supervisory relationship is different in how we form and build that relationship? What do you think is different about this? and I agree. Mary.
I was going to say that in the supervisor relationship, rather than a personal one, there are definitely boundaries that you don't want to cross. There are some that you may cross, not on purpose, but like life circumstances, blah, blah, blah. But overall, you want to create a structure that you kind of follow.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really important point, is that our boundaries are probably going to be a little bit different here in this professional relationship. And I do think this type of professional relationship can lend itself to some blurring of those boundaries, or it being easier to cross some of those boundaries. There's certainly, of course, blatant things that we would never do, but there are other ways where you really have this sort of intimate relationship with someone where those boundaries can be challenging. But absolutely, so maintaining those professional boundaries. And everyone's boundaries might look slightly different, and that's okay. There's certain things we would never do, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the semester, but that's a really good point. So different boundaries, as Mary mentioned. Any other ways where you think this might differ?
Yeah, just like the power differential would be different, obviously. I mean, even if they are, like in that one case that we discussed this week, the student, or the supervisee rather, seemed like a lot more experienced than their supervisor. So
yes.
Even in that kind of a situation, the supervisor still sort of has like this, this stance in the relationship that kind of like puts them at the level where they're, what's the word I'm looking for? They have to not criticize, but analyze the other
and
person.
Evaluate them, right?
Evaluate.
Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, yeah. I couldn't get that word out of my brain.
Yeah, Melissa, thank you. I think that's another really important point. So there is an inherent power differential in this relationship. We're not establishing a friendship. We're not establishing a romantic relationship. This is a professional relationship where there is a power differential, even if there's differences in experience, like you mentioned in the example that you talked about in discussion this week. But that person does have that evaluative power. So that inherently makes this relationship different. Really good point. So different boundaries, a power differential. Anything else that you think is an important way that the supervisory relationship differs? Just can't see everyone. Yeah, Sarah, go ahead.
The duties that they have are different. Like the supervisor's duties and the supervisee's duties are different. So that has to come into play as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. Right. The duties or the roles or responsibilities of each individual differ. Really important point. Okay. So thank you. I think some of the ways that we build these relationships, there are parallels. We use our social skills in similar ways in building this relationship, but we know there's different boundaries. There's a power differential. There's different roles and responsibilities. Really good points. So when I think about the supervisory relationship, there are some key elements that I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about. And I think you talked about some of these things already today. So trust. So building trust in a relationship, that's key to any relationship, but I think really important for this supervision relationship. So having honesty, the ability to rely on one another, that each individual shows up when they say they're going to. So this should become a safe, trusting environment, an open environment where things can be challenged. And you want to check in with your supervisees about this trust and how they feel like this is going. Self-disclosure is also an important part of the relationship. So this should be open. It should be a place where you can discuss issues in the relationship. Yes, you're going to come and discuss issues that you may be having with cases, but I would also hope that this is an open environment where if something's not working for a supervisee or vice versa with the supervisor, that they can talk openly about that in their relationship. So a place where individuals feel comfortable sharing their thoughts, their fears, their hopes, and their expectations regarding their work. That, of course, is built on that foundation of trust. So there's a question that's out there, and I'm interested in your thoughts or your experiences with this. Should a supervisor self-disclose? Should a supervisor share things about their own personal life or their experiences? What do you all think?
It's interesting because I've had this conversation before with people, and it really is a case-by-case basis. It should only be done when you think it's going to be benefiting the client, and that's like a hard thing to kind of work through, because you have to think about, like, am I doing this for myself to like say it, or am I doing it to help them? And it's not often that you do it either.
Yes, that's a really good point. So I think asking that question that you mentioned, Mary, am I doing this to benefit myself, or is this in some way benefiting the client or the supervisee? That is an important question to ask. So it sounds like maybe use sparingly. Eleanor, I know you had another thought.
I had the same exact thought.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, pretty much only if it benefits the client or is relevant to what the client's talking about. And I almost feel like it should only be if, like, you're trying to provide the client hope in one area or another of their life,
Sure.
not just like, oh yeah, that happened to me too, you know, or something like that.
Yeah. Other thoughts that anyone has?
So I actually, I ended up needing to go to this domestic violence shelter. This was several years ago. My kids and I had to go there, obviously, due to domestic violence. We had nowhere to go. And these women were so amazing that I eventually got the opportunity to start working there. So I work there now, and that is what I do. So I only tell certain clients sometimes, you know, like just to make them feel better or not go back to a dangerous situation.
Absolutely.
To know that there is something after this, like this is just temporary, like that kind of thing. And it does amazing things for them. So absolutely self-disclosure when it's appropriate and when it benefits the client. And then also there's definitely a point, like there's a line that you shouldn't cross. I had a supervisor that used to come in and talk to me about like her sex life with her new husband, and I was like,
that's uncomfortable.
Oh my God, like I was
right.
My God, I wanted to just crawl under the desk, and I just like yeah, blah. It was terrible. It was awful. So
that's not what we want to be doing, right? That's a perfect example of what we don't want to do. But you're right, Melissa. I think you sharing your experiences with your clients at the shelter, you're providing them with hope, and also they know that you can relate to what they're going through. I think that those are appropriate and useful opportunities for self-disclosure. So in the supervisory, Sarah, go ahead. Yes.
Hold on. She just moved. Okay,
Sure.
there you are. All right. Yep, that's you now. I think you can share personal things, but I had a bad experience with a supervisor who was big time an oversharer. So I think you can share, but to keep it simple. Like, don't elaborate. Don't go on and on and on and make the client feel overwhelmed by your stuff, you know? Just keep it short and sweet and to the point. I think that's best.
Absolutely. So, right, keeping this short so that the focus is then not off of the supervisee. That maybe if it sort of adds to their experience, there could be times where it's appropriate, but yes, shouldn't be sharing everything about your personal life, right? So when it comes to the supervisory relationship, again, everyone is going to have a different level of comfort with self-disclosure. I agree with everything that you all have said. So I think we need to think about if these self-disclosures are timely and appropriate, they may be useful. So this may be a time where it can help to build the working relationship, or it could help build an emotional bond. So when it comes to supervision, maybe sharing your own struggles would be something like, yes, when I first started seeing clients, I had this same challenge or something of that nature. But I think something to keep in mind, it can be useful, but I agree should be used sparingly and should be to benefit the supervisee. Another thing that can come up is transference and countertransference. And this is where the supervisee may transfer feelings to their supervisor. So the supervisor should just be aware of this and assist supervisees in developing competence in their problem-solving abilities. And if the supervisor experiences this countertransference, they could discuss this with their colleagues rather than with the supervisee. So we can always seek consultation from others. We don't have to be alone in this supervision experience. So a couple other key elements, diversity issues. So we know that we're not going to be the same as all of our supervisees. So discussing differences between the supervisor and the supervisee can be important. And thinking about this in terms of how might this impact the supervisory relationship. So we should teach to respect the role of that diversity plays in the therapy relationship, and also be open to discussion about how this impacts supervision as well. You all brought up boundaries already, and really important, so maintaining those appropriate boundaries. So we have both an ethical and a professional responsibility here. And then the key is, where do we draw the line? And we've already talked about the fact that sometimes this is going to be really clear, and other times the boundaries are going to be a little more blurred. And I think this is a really good opportunity to seek out supervision and consultation if you're ever not sure. And then power. So you talked about this as well, our ability to influence or control others and have authority, or our right to do so. We know there's this built-in power differential in the supervisory relationship. So I think being clear and upfront that this is an evaluative relationship, be clear about those expectations and setting goals. Those can be set together with the supervisee. How the supervisee will be evaluated, what the criteria is for that. And then if there are limits to confidentiality within this relationship, being really explicit about that. And it's important to self-monitor how we're doing in that relationship. And thinking about this as a parallel process. So how we act in supervision might offer insights into how the supervisee relates to clients. So if they come in and they're always very guarded or very quiet, or if they seek to really control the supervision session, those might be clues to how they may be acting in their therapeutic sessions as well. And then finally, personhood. So this is awareness of our values, of our attitudes, our beliefs, thinking about age, gender, ethnicity, spirituality, how all of these important things may impact the supervisory relationship. So this impact of similarities and differences between the supervisor and supervisee may be worthwhile to explore if it seems relevant. And then what if values are in conflict? This can certainly come up. We're not always going to hold the same values as our supervisees, and this may become clear throughout the relationship. And I think the biggest advice here is really to try to discuss this openly, that we may learn a lot from one another if we have open discussions about areas where we don't agree. So we've talked about what we think makes a good supervisor before. This is what your book says, and you can agree or disagree with some of these lists, but I think a lot of these things came up in our discussion. So having good clinical skills and knowledge, having an accepting supervisory climate, having the desire to train and invest in supervision, matching the supervisee's level of development. So thinking about if they're very early on in their training or their career, maybe not throwing them to the wolves, but if they've had a lot of experience, maybe not sitting there and holding their hand and doing live supervision for each session. Providing constructive feedback. Yeah, Melissa.
I just had a question. Is there a minimum amount of years that you have to be a licensed clinician before you become a supervisor?
That's a really good point. So there really isn't, to be honest. You could have someone who is newly licensed and they may be a superviser.
Eek, that's scary.
Potentially, right? It's not always the case, but yeah, I think that can happen. And I think it's great that you all, I mean, even when we scratch the surface in this class, that you start to have classes in supervision. Because I think even going through my master's and my doctoral program, we didn't have any classes in supervision. So nothing really taught you how to be a supervisor. You kind of maybe took the good and bad from your experiences. But I think having some explicit training can be useful. Because you're right. I think you might be thrown to this earlier than you'd expect. I think even when I was not licensed yet, I was doing like a postdoctoral fellowship. We did provide some umbrella supervision of graduate students who were earlier on in training. So sometimes you'll get experience throughout your training where you're still being supervised by someone else. But I think it certainly could be the case that you could be in a new job and maybe asked to take on supervision pretty early on. So good point. Yeah. So providing that constructive feedback. And again, I would argue that this should not just be that once or twice a year, that it should be ongoing and informal throughout the supervisory relationship. Being empathetic, we hope that that is a quality that we all have since we've chosen to enter this field. Being flexible and available, having good relationship skills. And this might speak to Melissa's point, maybe being an experienced clinician, which I think you won't always encounter. All right, so detrimental characteristics. I think some of these came up when we talked about this early on in the semester. So being too judgmental or overly critical, being personally or theoretically rigid, maybe not being open to other perspectives, not being committed to the supervisory process, being unavailable. I think that can be a big one. If you're not there, you can't really provide good supervision. Having limited clinical knowledge or skills, being unethical or having poor boundaries, and perhaps being too self-focused. So maybe using that whole session for self-disclosure. And to Melissa's point that you may have a supervisor who's maybe newly out of graduate school, I would argue that it doesn't necessarily make them a bad supervisor, but I think we do gain more skill with experience as well.
I think the scariest part about that is just thinking that I would be responsible to judge someone when I feel like I have no clue what I'm doing.
Sure. I will say it's interesting. If you look at studies, this isn't part of me about supervision, but if you look at studies that look at the effectiveness of clinicians, and I think some people assume, okay, these clinicians that have been in the field for 20 years, they're going to have better outcomes with their clients than newer clinicians. And the research actually doesn't support that. It could be that I would say newer clinicians are really up to date on maybe some of the latest evidence-based practices. And I think they might also be really concerned about their performance, right? They're going to work really hard for their clients. So I guess I would say if you are put into a supervisory position and you don't feel confident yet, it doesn't mean that you're not going to do a good job. I think you're going to be, if you're worried about it, that's probably a good thing, right? You're going to be aware of how you're doing and, that you're working hard for your supervisees. But good point. So we talk a lot about the supervisor, but I think there are characteristics also when we're a supervisee, when we're the one who's learning or in training, or being supervised, that are important. So having a desire to learn and improve, being non-defensive, so trying to be open to feedback, being open and flexible, also possessing knowledge and having good clinical skills, being intelligent, being responsible, and coming to supervision prepared. And then I think also just this willingness to sometimes take risks, to try out something new with your clients. So detrimental supervisee characteristics, things that might hinder one's ability to be supervised. So having that lack of openness or being fearful of evaluation, being really rigid, being defensive. Also, if you come in thinking that you know everything, that you don't need supervision, that can be really detrimental to your clients and to your own personal and professional development. Having a lack of motivation or interest, lacking intelligence, Psychopathology can be a challenge. This is not to say that if we experience our own mental health difficulties that we can't enter this field. I think for many individuals, it might be a motivation. Maybe they've had good experiences or bad experiences in the field that motivate them to want to do this work. So psychopathology isn't necessarily a problem, but of course, having appropriate support and intervention would be important for individuals who are experiencing psychopathology. And then I think finally, just immaturity can be a challenge. So what if we encounter conflicts in a supervisory relationship? I think one, it's going to happen. We know that conflict is really a natural part of any relationship that we're a part of. But if we can attempt to resolve these conflicts by listening, trying to understand where the supervisee is coming from, and working to clarify what the ground rules are for the relationship. So going back to that contract that we set at the outset. And this also sets the tone for working with conflict early in the supervisory relationship. So if a conflict comes up early, really set the tone for how this is going to be worked through. And ideally before problems occur. So I think maybe just being clear, look, early on in the relationship, if you ever don't agree with something I'm saying, or something I say offends you, it's always okay to come to me and talk about that, and I want you to do that. So knowing that they're going to be open to those differences of opinion, or if they feel offended, I think that's important. Just knowing that you're open to that feedback, and letting your supervisee, I can't talk, I'm gonna call him a supervisor, know that this is a place where they can express concerns or raise questions that pertain to the relationship, or of course to their clients. And if these conflicts come up, this is another really good opportunity for the supervisor to seek consultation, that they don't have to try to process these challenges all on their own. They can talk to others and try to work through this as well. And just get some other opinions about how they're handling things. So we know that it's a supervisor's role also to try to prepare their supervisees for challenges that the supervisees might encounter. So we know that having doubts, having fears, when you're a clinician or working in this field, it's really common. We all experience this. And having a fear of failing as a counselor is quite common. So we also might go and take full responsibility for client outcomes. Well, we're not fully responsible as the clinician for our clients' outcomes. Our clients have to be ready to change. They have to be willing to work. And sometimes I know advice I was given early on by a supervisor was, if you're coming in and you feel like you're always working harder than your client, there's a problem. They really need to be coming in and working hard as well. So also thinking about this as an opportunity in supervision to discuss those doubts, to discuss those fears. Again, having this be a place where the supervisee feels comfortable doing so. Also identifying unresolved personal problems. This is something that can come up when someone enters the field. So you may see yourself in some of your clients. That might bring up painful memories for you from your past. I think we also need to be aware of our biases or areas that might be difficult for us in our own lives. There might be certain types of clients that we can't work with or we don't want to work with, and that's okay. So working to ensure that this doesn't negatively impact our work with clients. So if this comes up, we really want to work with these clients, we're having challenges, we can discuss this in supervision and really maybe seek out some of our own counseling as well, if that would be useful. Avoiding the role of the problem solver. So as a supervisor, you can't go in and solve all the supervisee's problems for them. This should be a place where you can work these things out together. Identifying if that countertransference is occurring, so just establishing clear boundaries. And then again, respecting that we all have different value systems and really trying not to impose our own values on our supervisees. And a commitment to personal growth. And I would argue that this is personal growth for the supervisor as well. Okay, So what I would like to do, right, we're doing pretty well on time here. This is about a half an hour long. I'd like us to go through and watch this, maybe a little bit shorter than that. I think at the end, the person who's interviewed talks about their book, so I'll cut it off. We don't care about their book. But I would like you to think about this idea that Dr. Russell Chapin proposes. And she proposes this idea of a supervision question. So as you're watching, I just want you to think about what might be your supervision question. It might differ, from on a case-by-case basis, but what comes to mind for you? And then if we'll have a few minutes, hopefully at the end, I just want to talk about, any kind of thoughts or reactions that you have to this. So I'm going to stop sharing this. I'm going to pull this up for us.
Welcome to Therapy Talks, powerful ideas for modern practitioners. I'm Dr. Shannon Dermer from Governor State University, and I'm hosting this series of innovative talks presented by Alexander Street Press. We will focus on important topics in counseling for the trainee, professional, and educator. Experts in the field of counseling will offer solutions to some of the most challenging issues modern practitioners face. Today, we have the honor of Dr. Lori Russell Chapin joining us. She is a professor of counselor education and an award-winning teacher and researcher at Bradley University. Currently, she is the Associate Dean of the College of Education and Health Sciences and co-director for the Center of Collaborative Brain Research. Lori has published and presented extensively in the local, regional, national, and international arenas. She has co-authored books on practicum and internship, supervision, conflict resolution, grief and loss, and neurofeedback. She will be speaking to you on the topic of supervision in her therapy talk, The Supervision Question, an essential tool for supervision accountability. Please welcome Dr. Russell Chapin.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk about clinical supervision. It's been kind of a lifelong journey for me. It came out of perhaps not a love, but sort of a hate relationship that I had with clinical supervision. I'm guessing that maybe many of you might have felt some of the same feelings. So I want to start talking about supervision today by teaching you just a story, And my guess is all of you know something about this. When I was in my doctoral program, we had to sign up for those weekly supervisions, and I was always early because I didn't want to be late. And I noticed something, that every single time someone came out of this particular professor's office, they were sobbing. Tears were just streaming out of their face. And so the thing I learned from supervision that semester was, do not let this person make you cry. Now, there's something about that just didn't seem quite right to me. So I kind of, at that moment, said, I'm convinced that I'm going to learn something about supervision, and I'm going to be a better supervisor, and I'm not going to make people cry unless it's a healthy cry. I knew these people were crying because they've been criticized. So I began to think, well, what do you think we need to do about supervision? And here's what I think. I think we all carry around sort of a secret box that we have. And inside this box, this is my box here, it says, I'm a wild, wacky, wonderful woman who lives here. And inside this box, there are questions that we really kind of hide from other people. And here's the supervision question that I think we hide. from everybody. I wrote it down. Now yours may not be quite like mine, but I'm guessing it is. Here's what I wrote. What if I enter into supervision and my supervisor finds out that I don't have a clue what I'm doing? That's what I think most of us hide this question in some kind of a treasure box. So I decided that what we need to be doing is change the question that's inside our secret box. So I'm kind of proposing to all of you that we need to teach our supervisees about the importance of the supervision question and make sure that they have a question, not this question, but a question that will help us as supervisors know exactly what we should be doing in supervision. So that's what I want to talk about today. We got to start first of all with a definition of supervision. Now we know that the definition usually is a distinct approach and response for a supervisee from an expert, and I use that term a little bit loosely, who has a little more supervision knowledge and experience than they do. Now, what I think is fascinating about supervision is that for most of us, we became supervisors because we've been counselors for a while and we've been there longer than the person that they just hired. In my doctoral program, we didn't even have mandated supervision courses yet. Now we're mandating our courses in counseling, in our master's program, in our doctoral program, and I think all of us are much better for it. But I still don't think we make this process accountable. I don't think we make it empirically based. And I don't think we have enough evidence to talk about supervision. So what I want to do today, I've given you this definition. Now what I want to do is talk to you a little bit about the supervision question. It has a purpose and it does several things, I think, for us. The supervision question just tells the supervisee that I expect them every single time to come with a supervision question. And I want it to be in form of a question, but I want you to tell me exactly what it is that you're expecting. It has, as I said, it has a lot of purposes. I think the first purpose is it teaches accountability to the supervisee. The supervisee has to be responsible for the change. It can't come from the supervisor. So I think what it does is it helps us model well, it gives us expectations, and this is the only way I think we can get our supervision needs met, is by having the supervision question. So most of us have this process of supervision, and I think this is a pretty generic foundation process. But I want to talk to you about it briefly, and you'll see where the supervision question comes into play. So the first thing, of course, we have to do is we have to clarify expectations. The research shows that over and over, that if we know what the expectations are, then odds are we're going to get these things met. The expectations could be simple, like, be sure we're going to have supervision every week and let's try to be on time. That would be one. The expectations could be, what do I want from you as a supervisor? What do I want from you as a supervisee? So we clarify those expectations. I let them know that this process of accountability is on their side, and I want them to come at each time with a supervision question. I also then begin to explore any multicultural differences I have. It could be gender, it could be age, it could be ethnicity, it could be so many things, but what are our differences? We get that elephant out of the room. And then I say, what is it that you want out of supervision today? Give me your supervision question. They have this articulated question. This is where it becomes really important, though, I think. If we know what the question is, then we then have some hope of knowing which supervision model for us to select. I think so many of us in the past just said, well, I'll see the tape or I'll listen to you talk and we'll get something done. I think there really is a way to do supervision. The supervision question is asked. I listen carefully as the supervisor, and then I begin to think, wow, what supervision models should I be selecting? Now, most of us know, because we took supervision courses, that there are basically 5 models of supervision. And so I'm going to select one of those. Within those 5 models are many different, I suppose, theorists, but I'm going to select one of them. After I listen to the question, I make the selection, then we can do the rest of it. We discuss diagnosis, we discuss conceptualization, and then I start the process all over again. So I analyze the outcome, and then I'll see you next week. I think there's a parallel process between counseling and supervision, and so what we do in counseling is going to be something very, very similar to what I do in supervision, but this process continues over and over, and now my supervisee knows exactly what I expect. So what I'm going to do today is show you really 5 different unique supervision questions. As I give you this question, I really want you to think too, well, I wonder which model I would pick. I'm going to select the model for you, but I want to tell you why I've selected this model. We actually wrote a supervision book in which I do demonstrations of all these different models. And I carefully selected these supervisees. And I wanted them to come from a cross section. So this question is really interesting. The question reads, when my client sabotages the counseling outcome, what additional strategies could I implement? If you listen carefully to this question, I think it's fascinating. It came from a master social worker. This man's been doing therapy for 26 years, but the question is a great question. He is looking for introspection. He's looking for a colleague. He's wanting collegial supervision. And so to me, the developmental model seemed like the absolute best model to choose. We had an incredible counseling supervision. I think he got to a very different place because I forced him into a supervision question, and then I knew exactly what he wanted. So there's one example. Here's another example. This supervisee came to me, and here's the question. Now, this one's pretty easy to understand. How can I expand the effectiveness of my genograms? Well, we obviously know we're coming from a theoretical orientation, or it's discipline specific. And I think this one's fascinating. This person's saying, I really want to know more about this. So if I know something about genograms, I'm going to be doing supervision from that, certainly that aspect. But here comes the rub, I guess, which is what if I don't know anything about genograms? Well, that's not a big issue, because all I'm going to have to do is just refer them on to somebody else or have them come and join us for supervision. This came from a student who was about ready to graduate. You can see that. You can see that there's a little difference in this question than the first question. But theoretic specific supervision, I think, is incredibly important. I would have not known. I would have had to guess if they didn't have this supervision question. Here's another great question. Supervisee came to me and said, listen to this question. I let this client slowly creep into my personal life. How did I ever let this happen? I listened to that question and I thought, what supervision model should I choose? I mean, you can have varied examples of this, but this one seems so appropriate for social role model. The social role model says, I need to put on a hat. And what do I think this client needs? I think they need to be more aware of what's going on in therapy. That's the basic tenet of social role. And so what I decided to do is, okay, let's talk about process. Let's talk about conceptualization. Let's talk about personalization. And it was really interesting to me because once we started talking about this specific question, the supervisor knew exactly what they needed to do the next time they saw this client. Let me give you another example. Integrated models of supervision. You know, they tend to be atheoretical. And this is probably one of my favorite approaches. But here's the supervision question, and it's very different from the other ones I've given you. Listen to this one. I don't even know what skill to use when. Where do I even begin? This client or this supervisee is saying, I am lost in the counseling process. I love that it happened to be a she. I love that she was able to say to me, I'm lost. So I decided, I want to use an integrated model of supervision. This kind of goes back to my original story about sort of hating supervision. I also didn't like the fact that sometimes students might come to us and they'd say, I have a tape, it could be digital, could be, VHS in the olden days, and would you show a part of my tape? And I'd see 3 minutes of it, and then I'd give them an A, B, or C in the tape, and then off they go. I don't like that. So I decided, based upon Alan Ivey's micro-counseling skills, to devise a counselor interview rating form. Now this happened a long time ago, 1999. And I developed this interview rating form that you can quantify these digital recordings that you're watching. And you can quantify it by, are they doing masterful skills? Is there intention there? And I found what was fascinating about using this kind of interview rating form was I could really show them what their strengths were, what their voids were, and what was wrong. And I could answer this supervisee's question. From there, I decided, well, I think this is an actual supervision model, and I devised a supervision model. And I've been using this for a long time now. Like I said, I think since 1999. And what I'm finding is that not only is this good for beginning counselors, but it's really good in supervision, and it's really good for supervisors out there in the field as well. So I want you to begin to get that there's a very different feel for these different questions. I have one more question I want to share with you. This is the model I chose was interpersonal process recall, IPR, with Norm Kagan. I don't think most people even say it's a supervision model. I think it's more of an approach, but I love this approach, and I think many of us use this approach. And again, the question is, I seldom let any silence occur in the counseling session. Why can't I let my clients be quiet? I love IPR. I knew exactly which model to select because I thought this student, this supervisee, and this was a school counselor, she saw so many different students. And this school counselor was an old client or old student of mine. She just rattled constantly. She never let any kind of questions go. And she was afraid to be quiet, so I knew what to do. And I used all those wonderful questions that IPR originates out of IPR and just asked her, what's your deepest fear? And what do you think is going to happen, if you actually stop talking? And she was wonderfully, and I have this on the DVD, she was wonderfully quiet. She got kind of tears in her eyes, and she got to the source, that I'm afraid that they're going to find out in my box that I don't know what I'm doing. So if I keep talking, they'll maybe not get to that point. So I really think this strategy of using a supervision question is it's imperative, I think, if we want to do healthy supervision. So kind of in conclusion, what I want you to take away from this today is that I really do believe this statement, and I want you to kind of listen to this statement again, that what supervision questions do is they ensure that our therapeutic outcomes are no longer a questionable possibility, but an answerable question. I want to say it again, that using a supervision question ensures that therapeutic outcomes are no longer a questionable possibility, but an answerable question. Finally, we have a process of making supervision exactly what it's designed to be. So my call to action today is both professional and personal, and I'm going to start with personal. I'm a huge fan of lifetime supervision. I believe we should be doing supervision over the lifespan of our career. I'm in supervision now, and I love to go in and be a supervisee. We do it in a group, and in our group we have social workers, we have counselors, we have psychologists. So maybe we're all kind of coming at it from a much different perspective. But to me, I leave there and I'm refreshed, I'm rejuvenated. And in all my years of therapy, I have not one time been burned out. Now, this is a high burnout rate profession. So I'm a huge fan. So my kind of call to action is I want you to personally go and get into supervision if you're not. We've been supervisees before, we've been supervisors for now, for most of us. It's so much fun for me to go back and be a supervisee. So that's my personal call to action. My professional call to action is I want you to start utilizing supervision question. You don't have to do it exactly as I do it, but I really believe having this broad-based supervision question allows you to give some stability to the supervision process. It allows you to give some accountability to the supervision process. And it really does make us much more measurable. And if we want to move into this evidence-based supervision or empirical-based supervision, I think one of the only ways we can do it is through a supervision question. Help me help our supervisees become more accountable. Thank you.